By sunrise, Evelyn Carter's 83 cattle were packed against a new barbed wire fence, staring at the creek they had used for generations. Her wealthy neighbor, Richard Voss, had fenced the bank overnight and posted a sign declaring private property, no livestock access. Richard insisted that because the creek crossed his land, the water and every path leading to it were his to control. Evelyn did not cut the wire. Instead, she photographed everything, hauled emergency water, and opened the ranch records her father had preserved. When the sheriff confirmed that he could not remove a fence standing on Richard's property, Richard believed the dispute was already over. Days later, however, a state vehicle stopped beside the creek, and the man who stepped out was not another deputy. He was the district watermaster, and Richard was about to learn that owning the bank did not erase every right attached to it. Before we continue, tell us in the comments whether you think Richard had the right to block the cattle. Then stay with the story to see what the old ranch records revealed. Evelyn Carter knew something was wrong before she reached the north pasture because her cattle were making far too much noise. 83 head should have been spread across the grass at that hour, grazing their way toward the creek as the morning warmed. Instead, nearly the entire herd was crowded near the eastern boundary. Evelyn drove her ATV closer, then saw why. A new barbed wire fence ran along the creek bank. Heavy steel posts had been driven into the ground overnight, cutting the cattle off from the watering point they had used for as long as Evelyn could remember. A white sign hung from the wire, private property, no livestock access. "You've got to be kidding me," Evelyn whispered. Several cows paced along the fence while a calf pushed its nose between the wires before its mother pulled it away. The herd had not broken through, but the pressure against the barrier was increasing as more animals arrived behind the first group. Evelyn stopped the ATV and photographed everything: the fence, the sign, the freshly disturbed soil around the posts, the cattle, and the creek flowing only yards beyond them. Then she called her ranch hand. "Bring the portable troughs up here and start filling the water tank." He asked, "Something wrong with the creek?" Evelyn kept her eyes on the fence. "We can't get to it." A black pickup appeared on the opposite side 20 minutes later, and Richard Voss stepped out. Evelyn's wealthy neighbor had purchased the adjoining property 3 years earlier. Since then, he had renovated the house, rebuilt the barns, cleared several neglected fields, and replaced almost every old fence. Apparently, he had saved this section for last. "You put this up?" Evelyn asked. Richard glanced at the wire. "Yesterday." Without saying anything, "It's my boundary. My cattle water here." "Not anymore." Evelyn stared at him. "That access has been used for decades. That doesn't make this your land." "I didn't say it was." Richard pointed toward the creek. "My survey puts the bank inside my property line." "Then show me the survey. I'll send you a copy." Evelyn looked at the herd again. "I'm not asking who owns the bank. I'm telling you this ranch has always watered cattle at this creek." Richard gave a small shrug. "You'll need another arrangement." Evelyn could have cut the fence for half a second, looking at 83 thirsty cattle. She wanted to, but she didn't. Instead, she recorded the location, called for another water tank, and began moving the herd toward temporary troughs. If Richard was wrong, she wanted proof, and if he was right, cutting his fence would only create a second problem. Before leaving, she photographed the sign one more time. Richard watched from across the wire. "You're wasting your time, Evelyn." "We'll see." "There's nothing to see." He placed one hand on a fence post, then pointed toward the water behind him. "My land, my creek." Evelyn said nothing, but as she drove back toward the ranch house, she remembered a metal box of old records her father had kept for more than 30 years. Because Richard might own that bank, but that did not necessarily mean he owned the right to decide who could use the water. By the time the portable troughs were positioned, the temperature had already started climbing. Evelyn and her ranch hands separated the herd into smaller groups so the older cows and calves would not be crowded away from the water. The first tank load disappeared faster than she expected, forcing him to return to the main well while she watched for signs of heat stress. None of the cattle were in immediate danger, but livestock could not wait several days while landowners debated paperwork. Evelyn knew the herd's safety remained her responsibility regardless of who had created the obstruction. So she recorded the time of each delivery, the fuel used, the hours worked, and the condition of the cattle. Late that morning, a sheriff's deputy arrived after Evelyn reported the unexpected barrier. He walked the boundary, looked at Richard's sign, and examined several of the new posts. Richard produced a digital copy of his survey on his phone. The deputy studied it, then turned toward Evelyn. I can document the dispute, but if this fence is entirely on his property, I can't tear it down based on a verbal claim about historical access. Evelyn nodded. I understand. If there's an easement or water right involved, that will have to be verified through the proper records. Richard folded his arms. So the fence stays. The deputy answered carefully. I'm saying I don't have authority to remove it today. I'm not deciding the underlying property or water right dispute. Richard heard only the first part. Evelyn paid attention to the second. She gave the deputy copies of her photographs, obtained an incident number, and made certain his report reflected that 83 cattle had lost access to their traditional watering location. She did not accuse Richard of stealing water, and she did not claim ownership of his creek bank. She simply preserved what had happened and when. That afternoon, Richard emailed Evelyn the survey. She printed it and spread it across her kitchen table, hoping to find a boundary mistake, but there wasn't one. The new fence appeared to sit entirely inside Richard's property. Evelyn leaned back. So he owns the ground. That eliminated the easiest argument, but it did not answer what rights might already exist across that ground. She went to the hall closet and pulled out the metal document box her father had kept after turning the ranch over to her. Inside were grazing leases, cattle records, tax receipts, old maps, veterinary papers, and decades of correspondence. Near the bottom was a folder marked Waiter, North Pasture. The papers went back farther than Evelyn expected. One faded photograph showed cattle drinking at the exact bend Richard had fenced off. Another map showed a narrow livestock trail running from Evelyn's pasture to the creek. Then she found an official water record identifying her ranch. The listed purpose was stock watering, and beside it was a priority date decades older than Richard's ownership. Evelyn read it twice. It looked important, but she knew enough not to assume it solved everything. A right to use water and a right to cross someone else's land to reach it might be two different things, so she kept searching. Near the back of the folder was an older property map, where a narrow corridor had been drawn between the ranch boundary and the creek. Beside it were several handwritten words Evelyn could barely read. Livestock access, see deed record. She stared at them. That notation was not proof by itself, but it pointed towards something she had not known existed. The next morning, Richard was waiting near the fence. Get my survey? I did. So we're clear. About the boundary. Richard frowned. What else is there? Evelyn held up the water record. Do you know what this is? Old ranch paperwork. Maybe that's why I'm checking. Richard pointed toward the creek. My survey says your cattle have to cross my property. It does. Then there's nothing else to discuss. Evelyn folded the document. Unless someone had the right to cross it before you bought it. Richard laughed. You have that right? I don't know yet. His smile faded slightly. Back at the ranch house, Evelyn called the state water office and read the identification number from the stock water record. After a short pause, the woman confirmed that a recognized historical stock water use was associated with Evelyn's ranch. Evelyn then asked about the handwritten livestock corridor. That's a property access question, the woman explained. You'll need the underlying deed or recorded easement. Our water record alone doesn't establish a right to cross private land. The answer was less satisfying than Evelyn had hoped, but it made the problem clearer. She now needed to establish two separate things: that the ranch held a recognized right to use water from the creek, and that its cattle had an existing legal way to reach the historical watering point across Richard's land. She looked again at the faded notation. Livestock access, see deed record. Richard's survey had proved where his property began. Now Evelyn needed to learn what rights had already been crossing it long before he arrived. By the fourth morning, Evelyn had developed a new routine she never wanted. Before checking fences or moving cattle, she checked water. The portable troughs had to be filled before the August heat settled over the pasture. Her ranch hand hauled water from the main well, while Evelyn monitored the 83 cattle crowded into a grazing rotation that had never been designed around tanks. The herd was safe, which mattered more than anything. But keeping them safe was costing her fuel, labor, extra trips with the water trailer, and pasture she could not use efficiently because the cattle could no longer move through their normal watering pattern. The animals also gathered around the temporary troughs more densely than they had along the open creek, which meant Evelyn had to watch the calves carefully and move the troughs whenever the surrounding ground became muddy or trampled. She wrote everything down, not because she knew where the dispute would end, but because she didn't. Richard drove past shortly before noon and slowed when he saw the water trailer. Looks like you solved your problem. Evelyn closed the valve on the tank. I solved today's problem. Seems pretty permanent to me. You think I'm hauling load after load because you put up a fence? Richard stepped out of his truck. You have water. Your cattle are fine. They are fine because I made sure they were. Exactly. Evelyn wiped her hands on her jeans. Temporary water doesn't erase a water right. Richard's expression changed. So that's what the state office told you. They confirmed there's a stock water record associated with my ranch. Richard laughed. Associated with your ranch isn't the same as giving your cattle permission to cross my property. I know. Again, her refusal to overstate the case seemed to frustrate him. Then what's your point? My point is that I'm finding out exactly what the record allows before I give up something this ranch may have had for generations. That afternoon, Evelyn received instructions from the state water office. They wanted copies of her records, photographs of the fence, a map of the traditional watering location, and a written description of how the cattle had historically accessed the creek. She began assembling everything. Old photographs helped establish the location. Her father's maps showed the same crossing. Recent ranch records documented livestock use, and Richard's new fence provided a clear date when access had changed. Evelyn did not claim any one item proved her entire case. She simply sent what she could verify. She also included the sheriff's incident number, photographs taken before any cattle could disturb the ground, delivery logs for the emergency water, and a statement explaining that the herd still contained all 83 animals. No cattle had disappeared, been sold, or died during the dispute. They were being kept safe through Evelyn's temporary arrangements. 2 days later, she returned to the creek and found Richard working with a fencing contractor. They were replacing temporary sections with heavier posts, and a new brace stood beside the traditional cattle path. You reinforcing it? Evelyn asked. Richard nodded. I don't want 83 cows pushing through. They haven't. I intend to keep it that way. Evelyn looked at the new posts. Once completed, the fence would be harder to modify and nearly impossible for cattle to pass without a proper gate. There's an active review now, Richard. Good. He gestured toward the wire. They can review whatever they want. The contractor started stretching another section tight while Richard watched him work. My survey says this is mine. Evelyn looked beyond the fence at the creek, then back at the portable water trailer waiting behind her. Richard still believed the dispute was entirely about where his property ended, but the state had begun asking a different question. And while that question was being reviewed, Richard was making the barrier even more permanent. By the end of the week, Richard's fence looked as though it had stood there for years. Steel corner posts anchored both ends of the creek section, fresh barbed wire ran between them, and the old cattle trail disappeared behind a locked service gate Richard had installed for his equipment. Evelyn stood on her side and photographed the finished work. The gate bothered her most because Richard could reach the creek whenever he wanted, while her cattle could not. That afternoon, the state water office called. A specialist named Karen Mills asked Evelyn to describe exactly how the herd had historically used the creek. Did you divert water onto your property? No. Did you pump it? No. Was there a trough connected to the creek at that location? No. Then how did the livestock obtain the water? They walked down the same trail and drank directly from the creek. For how long? Evelyn looked at the records spread across her kitchen table. Longer than I've owned the ranch. My father's records show the same location, and some of these documents go back decades. Karen paused. And that access is now physically blocked? Completely. Send me photographs of the new gate and fence. Evelyn did. Karen was careful not to promise anything. The stockwater record mattered, she explained, but the office still needed to determine its scope, historical place, and manner of use, and whether Richard's fence actually interfered with an established use. Owning a water right did not automatically give someone unlimited permission to cross another person's property, but owning the creek bank did not automatically settle every water use question either. How long will the review take? Evelyn asked. I can't promise a timeline. I have 83 cattle on temporary water. Keep doing what you're doing for the herd. Document your costs and don't alter Mr. Voss's fence. I won't. The next morning, Evelyn drove to the creek with another load of water, where Richard was standing beside his new gate. Still hauling? Still hauling. He nodded toward the fence. Looks like the state hasn't ordered me to remove anything. They haven't finished reviewing it. They won't. Evelyn stopped beside the trough. You sound very certain. I bought this land, paid for the survey, and paid for that fence. None of those things tells you what my water record says. Richard smiled. An old stock water record doesn't make my property yours. I've never said it did. That evening, another message arrived from Karen. The office had located additional historical material associated with Evelyn's record. The recognized livestock use appeared to predate Richard's purchase by decades. More importantly, the historical location in the state file matched the same bend in the creek Richard had just fenced off. Evelyn read the message twice. It was still not a final determination, but Richard's newest fence had not merely closed a convenient place for cattle to drink. It had closed the exact location identified in the historical water use records. Now the state wanted to know why. Richard had strengthened his fence at the worst possible place, and at the worst possible time. 2 days later, Evelyn Carter sat across from a water rights attorney with 4 documents spread between them: Richard Voss's survey, the stock water record, the historical map, and the handwritten notation Evelyn had found: livestock access, see deed record. The attorney studied the last document longest. This is the piece I'd want to trace. Because it proves access. No, because it tells us where to look for proof. Evelyn nodded. She was becoming accustomed to answers that came with conditions. The attorney pulled up older property records and followed the references backward through several transfers, comparing legal descriptions instead of relying only on the lines drawn on modern maps. Eventually, he stopped there. An older recorded instrument described a narrow livestock access corridor running from what was now Evelyn's ranch to the creek. The language was not broad. It did not give Evelyn general access to Richard's property, and it did not allow vehicles, recreation, or unrestricted use of the creek bank. It existed for a specific purpose connected to livestock reaching the historical watering location. Evelyn stared at the record. So my cattle can cross? Potentially within this defined use, yes, but I want the complete chain reviewed before I tell you to open any gate or move a single animal across his property. He placed the access record beside the water file. These are 2 separate pieces. He tapped the first. This supports the ranch's recognized stock water use. Then he touched the second. This may establish the property access necessary to exercise that use. So Richard's survey is wrong? No. The attorney shook his head. His survey may be perfectly correct. Evelyn frowned. Then how can both be true? Because ownership doesn't necessarily mean land is free of existing rights. He pointed to the corridor. Richard can own the ground and still own it subject to a recorded easement. That was the distinction Evelyn had been missing. A survey could locate a boundary accurately without identifying every restriction, easement, or right affecting the land inside that boundary. The access instrument did not move Richard's property line 1 inch, but if it remained legally effective, he could not treat the defined corridor as though no other interest existed there. The attorney warned Evelyn not to assume the document was automatically enforceable merely because it was old. They needed to verify that it applied to the current parcels, that it had not been released, relocated, abandoned, or extinguished, and that Evelyn's proposed use remained consistent with its stated purpose. Evelyn agreed. She wanted a defensible answer, not a convenient one. That evening, Richard was waiting near the pasture entrance with an envelope. I've got a solution. Inside was a 2-page agreement. Richard would open a livestock gate and allow Evelyn's cattle to reach the creek. In return, she would pay an annual access fee. More importantly, the document described her use as permission granted by the landowner, terminable under certain conditions. Evelyn looked up. You want me to rent access? I'm giving you what you've been asking for. What if I already have it? Richard smiled. You don't. Evelyn removed a copy of the older record from her folder. Have you seen this? His smile weakened. She showed him the corridor description. Richard read several lines, then handed it back. That thing is ancient. So is the water right. My deed says I own the property. I'm not disputing that. Then pay the fee and this ends. Evelyn folded his agreement. No. His face hardened. then keep hauling water. Richard drove away, and Evelyn watched his truck disappear before looking again at the two records. For weeks, Richard had treated the dispute as one question: who owned the land? Now Evelyn had evidence that the real question was different. What existing rights came with that land when Richard bought it? The next morning, she arranged her records across the tailgate of her pickup. The stockwater file was in one folder, the old recorded livestock access corridor in another. Beside them were photographs of Richard's fence, maps of the creek, receipts from hauling water, the sheriff's report, and a timeline showing exactly when the cattle had lost access. For the first time since the dispute began, Evelyn fully understood why both sets of records mattered. One addressed the water, while the other addressed how her cattle historically reached it. At 8:15, Richard drove up and noticed the folders immediately. Still trying to prove that old paperwork controls my land? I'm trying to understand what came with your land when you bought it. I know what came with it. I have a deed, and maybe an easement burdening part of it. Richard's expression tightened. He walked to the locked gate. My offer still stands. He tapped the chain. Annual fee, I give you access and your cattle can drink today. Evelyn looked at him. If that recorded corridor is valid, why would I pay you every year for permission to use something the ranch already has a right to use? Because it's my property, subject to whatever valid rights were already recorded against it. Richard shook his head. Your lawyer tell you to say that? My lawyer told me not to pretend we know the final answer yet. That stopped him. Evelyn was not claiming the old document gave her unlimited access, because it didn't. The corridor was narrow and tied specifically to livestock reaching the historical watering point. But if the record remained legally effective, Richard's fence sat directly across it. At 8:47, a white state vehicle appeared at the end of the ranch road. Richard looked toward it. That's your water people? Yes. A second vehicle followed but stopped farther back. Karen Mills stepped from the first truck carrying the state water file. She introduced herself to Richard, then walked with Evelyn toward the creek while Richard followed. Karen compared the historical map with the current fence and asked Evelyn to identify where the cattle had traditionally entered. Evelyn pointed toward the locked gate. Right there. Karen checked the map and the access record. Evelyn handed her a copy. Karen read it, then returned it. This is important, but I need to be clear. Our office administers the water rights side. We don't create private easements or decide every property title dispute. I understand. Richard immediately seized on that. So the state can't order me to give her my land. Karen looked at him. No one is asking you to give her your land. She pointed toward the creek. What we're reviewing is whether a recognized stockwater use exists here and whether recent changes are interfering with its exercise. The recorded access document is a separate property right issue that will also matter. Richard looked from Karen to Evelyn. For the first time, his survey was no longer the only document in the conversation. Karen opened the state file. The district watermaster will inspect the site as part of this review. When? Evelyn asked. Karen looked toward the road. He's finishing another inspection nearby. Then she added, he'll be here this morning. Richard glanced at the locked gate. The argument had finally split into the two questions he had treated as one from the beginning: who had the right to use the water, and what existing right allowed the cattle to reach it. Thomas Avery spent nearly 40 minutes at the creek before asking anyone another question. He photographed the locked gate, measured the distance from the fence to the water, compared the current cattle trail with the historical map Karen had brought, then walked upstream. Richard followed him. You can see the fence is on my property. Avery nodded. I can. And Carter's cattle have to cross my ground to reach the creek. That's what we're examining. Richard frowned. What's left to examine? Avery did not answer. Instead, he returned to Evelyn's pickup and opened the oldest file. The records told a story Richard had never bothered to investigate. The stockwater use was not something Evelyn had invented after he built the fence. It appeared in documents from decades earlier. Old maps identified the same creek bend. Livestock records supported continuous ranch use, and historical photographs showed cattle entering at almost the exact location where Richard's locked gate now stood. None of those documents alone settled every legal question. Together, however, they established something important. The watering practice existed long before Richard bought the neighboring property. Avery turned toward Evelyn. Has the location changed during your ownership? No. Different crossing? No. Any pump or diversion added? No. They walk down and drink. And before the fence. Nothing prevented access. Avery wrote that down. He also asked how often the herd used the creek, whether the route changed with the seasons, and whether any prior owner had ever demanded a fee. Evelyn answered from her own experience and distinguished it from what she knew only through records. During her ownership, the herd had used the same approach whenever the north pasture was active. No one had charged for access, and no gate had previously blocked the route. When she did not know an answer, she said so. Richard stepped closer. People using something for years doesn't automatically make it theirs. Correct, Avery said. Richard seemed surprised. Then we're finished. No. Avery pulled another record from the folder. The state file identifies stock watering associated with Ms. Carter's ranch. What we're determining is the scope of that recognized use and how it was historically exercised. Richard pointed toward his gate. But that's still my land. Avery looked at him. Your ownership is part of the analysis. It isn't the entire analysis. For the first time, Richard stopped repeating the survey. Then Avery noticed something near the lower fence line. He walked downstream and crouched beside a section of freshly disturbed soil. What was done here? Richard followed. Bank cleanup. When? A couple of weeks ago. Before or after the fence? About the same time. Evelyn moved closer. She had not paid much attention to that section. Because she had been focused on the block cattle trail, now she saw that Richard had reshaped part of the bank and extended fencing toward the water. Avery compared the area with one of the older photographs, then asked Karen for another map. Richard's confidence began to disappear. What's the problem? Avery stood. I don't know that there's a problem yet. He pointed toward the disturbed bank. But I need to determine whether your work changed more than livestock access. Richard looked toward Evelyn, but she said nothing. Avery had arrived to investigate a locked gate. Now he was studying something Richard had done beside the creek itself. He walked back toward the state vehicle and retrieved another set of measuring equipment, and suddenly, the fence was no longer the only thing Richard had to explain. Avery spent another 20 minutes measuring the creek bank, then called Evelyn and Richard over. Richard arrived first. Whatever you're measuring, that fence is still inside my boundary. Avery folded the measuring rod. I haven't questioned your survey. Then I don't understand the problem. The problem is that you keep answering a land question when I'm asking a water question. Richard fell silent. Avery opened the state file. The records support a recognized stock water use associated with the Carter Ranch at this location. The historical maps also place that use at this same bend. That doesn't give her my land. No one said it does. Avery pointed toward the locked gate. What matters from our review is whether your recent work interferes with the exercise of that recognized use. Richard's attorney joined them by phone. For several minutes, the discussion became more technical. The attorney emphasized Richard's ownership, while Avery kept returning to the same distinction: land ownership, water use, historical location, and existing access. Those interests overlapped at the creek, but they were not automatically identical. Finally, Richard interrupted. So what exactly are you saying I did wrong? Avery looked toward the bank. That's what we're still determining. He walked downstream and Evelyn followed. Richard had cleared vegetation from a shallow section and reshaped the bank before installing the fence. Several rocks had been moved, and fresh soil showed where equipment had worked near the water. Avery held up an older photograph. The cattle trail in the image descended gradually to the creek. The current bank was steeper, and Richard's fence crossed the upper end of that same approach. Why did you change this section? Avery asked. Erosion control. Was that work permitted or reviewed? Richard hesitated. It was maintenance. That's not what I asked. Karen began photographing the disturbed area. Richard looked increasingly irritated. I improved my own property. I didn't divert the creek. Avery nodded. I haven't said you did. Then why does this matter? Because the state record isn't merely a piece of paper saying water somewhere in this creek. Location and historical use can matter, and we need to determine whether your work physically prevented an established stock water use from being exercised. Richard pointed toward Evelyn. She has tanks, her cattle aren't dying. Evelyn started to answer, but Avery stopped her with a raised hand. Emergency water isn't the issue. He looked directly at Richard. The question is whether someone can interfere with an existing recognized use, then argue that the right no longer matters because its holder found an expensive temporary substitute. Richard's face tightened. For the first time, he appeared to understand why Evelyn had refused his annual access agreement. Accepting Richard's document might not merely have cost her money. It could also have created confusion by describing a pre-existing right as temporary permission originating with him. Avery closed the file. I'm not issuing a final determination beside the creek. We'll finish reviewing the records first. Richard exhaled, then Avery added, until then, don't make any further changes to this bank or the fence alignment. Richard stared at him. And if your review confirms her use? Avery looked toward the locked gate. Then we're going to discuss how that use can continue without pretending your property rights don't exist either. Evelyn understood immediately. This was not going to end with Richard losing his land. It was going to end with both sets of rights having to coexist. And the fence Richard had built as if only one of them mattered was now the first thing the watermaster intended to address. 2 days after the site inspection, Thomas Avery returned to the creek. This time, Richard had his attorney with him, and Evelyn brought hers too. Avery placed the state water records on the hood of his truck. The water review supports a recognized stockwater use associated with the Carter Ranch at this location. Richard's attorney nodded. But that doesn't create a right across my client's property. No, Avery said. It doesn't. Richard glanced at Evelyn as if he had finally heard the answer he wanted. Then Evelyn's attorney opened another folder. That's why the water right isn't the only document we're relying on. He placed the older recorded instrument beside Richard's survey. The livestock access corridor Evelyn had discovered had now been traced through the property records. Its location matched the historical cattle approach, and its purpose was narrow, livestock passage between Evelyn's ranch and the established watering point. Nothing they had found showed that the recorded access had been formally released or extinguished when Richard purchased his property. The attorney explained that the document's age did not make it meaningless. The important questions were whether it had been properly recorded, whether its legal description matched the current parcels, whether later instruments had altered it, and whether the present use remained within its original purpose. After tracing the chain of title, the available records continued to carry the corridor forward. Richard stared at the document. My title company never mentioned this. His attorney looked at him. We'll need to review your title files separately. That was an issue between Richard, his closing records, and possibly the professionals involved in his purchase. It did not erase Evelyn's documented interest. Avery pointed toward the creek. This is where the two issues meet. He tapped the state record. The water file supports the historical stockwater use. Then Evelyn's attorney indicated the second document, and the property record supports a defined route used to reach it. Richard looked toward his fence. So you're saying I don't own that strip? No, Evelyn's attorney replied. You own it. An easement doesn't transfer ownership. It means ownership can be subject to a specific existing right. That distinction changed everything. Richard's survey had never been wrong. His assumption had been. They walked to the locked gate. The old map placed the livestock corridor almost directly beneath it. Worse for Richard, the bank work he had recently completed had narrowed and steepened part of the historical approach. Avery examined the disturbed soil. From the water administration side, this location needs to remain capable of serving the recognized stockwater use. Evelyn's attorney added, and from the property access side, Richard can't simply fence across a recorded corridor as though it doesn't exist. Richard turned to his own attorney. Can they make me remove the whole fence? Not necessarily. That answer surprised him. Evelyn was not entitled to Richard's entire creek bank, and her cattle did not gain permission to wander across his property. The recorded corridor had a limited purpose, and that limitation protected Richard too. It meant Evelyn could exercise the right she actually had without converting it into a broader claim. Avery pointed toward the heavy fence posts. A controlled access point appears to be the practical solution. A gate, Richard said. A gate and a defined livestock corridor, Evelyn's attorney replied. Richard looked at the chain he had installed specifically to keep the cattle out. Weeks earlier, he had offered to unlock it only if Evelyn paid him every year. Now the documents told a different story. The water right had not given Evelyn ownership of Richard's land. and the access easement had not given her unlimited use of it. But together they answered the question Richard should have investigated before erecting the fence. He had bought the land, but he had not bought it free of every right that existed before him. Richard did not like the proposed solution. 3 days after the Watermaster's review, everyone met at the creek again, where Avery showed them a simple access plan. Most of Richard's fence could remain exactly where it was. A defined corridor would follow the historical cattle approach and end at the established watering point, while a livestock gate would control entry from Evelyn's pasture. The section of bank Richard had disturbed would be graded only enough to restore safe passage and stabilize the approach, with no widening of the corridor beyond what was reasonably necessary for the stockwater use. Richard stared at the drawing. "So I have to put a gate in my fence. You need a workable way for the recognized use to continue," Avery said. "On my land, along the location we've been discussing." Richard turned toward Evelyn. "And she can open it whenever she wants?" Avery shook his head. "The access is for the recognized stockwater use. It doesn't give Ms. Carter general access to your property." Evelyn added nothing. She did not need a picnic spot beside Richard's creek. She needed water for 83 cattle. Richard's attorney reviewed the proposed corridor. "What about damage?" "Both properties still have to be managed responsibly," Avery replied. "This doesn't eliminate reasonable livestock control." That was why the gate and side fencing mattered. Evelyn could move cattle through a defined point rather than allowing them to spread along Richard's bank, and Richard could maintain his boundary fence without blocking the established watering arrangement. Evelyn agreed to supervise the herd while the corridor was in use, secure the gate afterward, monitor the approach for erosion, and avoid entering any area outside the defined route. Richard retained the right to maintain the surrounding property, so long as he did not obstruct or materially impair the established use. It was less dramatic than tearing everything down, but far more practical. Richard still hated it. "I offered her access weeks ago. For an annual fee," Evelyn said. "I offered you a gate. You offered me permission you could later terminate." Richard looked at Avery. "What's the difference?" Evelyn answered before Avery could. "Your agreement said the right came from you." She pointed toward the records on Avery's truck. "This arrangement recognizes that it didn't." For several seconds, Richard said nothing. Then he looked toward the portable water trailer parked beyond Evelyn's cattle. "How much has hauling water cost you?" "Enough." "You planning to come after me for that too?" "I've documented it." Richard exhaled slowly, and his attorney pulled him aside. They spoke quietly near the creek for several minutes. The documentation Evelyn had kept made the temporary burden difficult to dismiss. Every tank trip, hour of labor, gallon of fuel, and disruption to grazing management had a date attached to it. Evelyn was not demanding a dramatic penalty beside the creek, but she had preserved her ability to address the losses through the appropriate process. When Richard returned, the fight seemed to have gone out of his voice. "If I agree to the gate and corridor, this ends." Avery answered carefully. "It resolves the physical interference issue if the final arrangement complies with the recognized use and applicable requirements. Any private claim over documented costs is a separate matter for the parties and their attorneys." Richard looked at Evelyn. "And you stay inside the corridor." "My cattle need water, Richard. They don't need your whole ranch." The following morning, a fencing contractor arrived, not to remove Richard's entire fence, but to modify it. One section of wire came down, a heavy livestock gate went between two reinforced posts, and side fencing clearly defined the route between Evelyn's pasture and the historical watering point. The approach to the creek was adjusted so cattle could reach the water safely without spreading along the bank or crowding onto the steeper ground Richard had created. Richard watched from his pickup. Evelyn waited until the contractor finished before approaching. For weeks, the gate at this location had been locked against her herd. Now Richard walked over, carrying a new chain. He held it for a moment, then, without asking Evelyn for a check, an annual fee, or a signature calling the access his permission, Richard Voss opened the gate. Evelyn did not bring the herd down immediately. She had waited weeks for that gate. Another hour would not hurt. First, she walked the entire corridor with her ranch hand, checking the new posts, gate latch, side fencing, footing, and the restored approach. Then Evelyn followed the cattle trail to the creek and inspected the bank. The ground was firm enough for livestock again, but she wanted to be certain 83 cattle would not crowd onto an unsafe slope. Thomas Avery had made one thing clear: recognizing Evelyn's water use did not remove her responsibility to manage the herd properly. She planned to move the cattle in controlled groups during the first visit, allowing the older animals to establish the route before the remainder followed. Her ranch hand would stay at the pasture entrance, while Evelyn positioned herself near the creek to keep the cattle inside the corridor. By late afternoon, she was satisfied. Bring them down. The cattle knew the route, and that surprised her. After weeks of drinking from portable troughs, the first cows still turned toward the old trail almost immediately. Evelyn opened the livestock gate. A few older cows passed through first. Then the rest followed, not running or panicking, simply moving toward a place that had been part of their routine long before Richard bought the neighboring property. The side fencing kept them from spreading along the bank, and Evelyn slowed the second group until the first had finished drinking and begun returning uphill. Within minutes, cattle lined the creek, heads lowered as water moved around their muzzles. Evelyn stood beside the gate and counted carefully. 83, every one of them. There had been 83 cattle on the first morning, 83 throughout the weeks of emergency hauling, and 83 returned to the creek. For the first time since Richard built the fence, there was no water trailer waiting behind the herd. Richard watched from farther up the bank. Eventually, he walked toward Evelyn. They remembered. They've used this place for years. He looked at the cattle. So this is how it's going to work now. Defined corridor, stock watering, and the gate stays secured when we're not using it. Richard nodded. And you don't get access anywhere else. I never asked for it. He kicked lightly at the dirt, then asked the question Evelyn knew had been bothering him. So you get to use my property forever? Evelyn looked toward him. I get to use the water and corridor according to the rights already recognized. I don't get more than those records allow, and you don't get to erase them simply because you own the ground. Still feels like somebody took something from me. No one took your land. She pointed toward the fence. It's still your fence. Then she pointed toward the gate. But owning the fence didn't mean you could pretend everything behind it belonged only to you. Richard did not answer. Over the next several days, Evelyn stopped hauling emergency water. The grazing rotation returned to normal, fuel use dropped. Hours she had spent moving tanks went back into ranch work, and the areas surrounding the temporary troughs were rested before the soil suffered lasting damage. The cattle settled into their old routine, as though the dispute had never happened. Evelyn continued supervising the corridor instead of assuming the documents excused careless management. She checked the bank after each use, made sure the gate latched securely, and kept the herd moving so no single section became overworked. One evening, Evelyn went down alone to close the gate after the herd returned. Richard's original white sign was still attached to a nearby post. Private property, no livestock access. She stared at it for a moment. Then Richard approached from his side and read the sign too. Without saying anything, he pulled a screwdriver from his truck. 4 screws later, the sign came down. Evelyn watched him carry it away. The fence remained, the property line remained, and Richard still owned his land. But the message he had nailed beside the creek no longer matched reality, and this time, Richard was the one removing it. By the end of summer, the north pasture looked ordinary again, which was exactly how Evelyn wanted it. Her 83 cattle moved through their normal grazing rotation. When they needed water, Evelyn opened the livestock gate and guided them down the defined corridor. They drank, returned, and the gate closed behind them. There were no arguments, no water trailers, no emergency troughs, and no one needed to cut a fence. Richard still owned the land on his side of the boundary, and his fence remained standing along most of the creek. Evelyn had never gained unrestricted access to his property, nor had she asked for it. What changed was much narrower. Richard could no longer use his fence in a way that blocked the recognized stockwater use associated with Evelyn's ranch and the recorded routes serving it. The distinction had taken weeks, old records, legal review, and a visit from the water master to establish. But once it was understood, the physical solution was surprisingly simple. 1 gate, 1 controlled corridor, and 2 property owners keeping the rights they actually had. Evelyn kept copies of everything: the historical maps, stockwater records, photographs of the original barrier, sheriff's report, correspondence from Karen Mills, inspection notes, final access arrangement, and even the receipts from the weeks she had spent hauling water. She placed them in a new binder and wrote across the front, "North Pasture, Water." Her father had preserved enough paperwork to help her understand what the ranch had inherited. Evelyn intended to make sure the next owner would not have to search through an old metal box to discover it again. She also attached a current map showing the exact corridor, photographs of the completed gate, and written instructions explaining how the route should be used and maintained. The lesson was not that old documents automatically defeated new owners. It was that both sides needed to know what those documents actually said before changing a place that had served neighboring properties for generations. One evening, Richard stopped near the gate while Evelyn was bringing the cattle back. He watched the last cow pass through. "I really thought the survey settled it," he said. "It settled the boundary, not the water." Evelyn latched the gate. "Not everything about it." Richard looked toward the creek. "I still own that bank." "You do. And you still have to respect the fence." "I do." He gave a small nod. For once, neither of them needed to win the conversation. Richard returned to his house, and Evelyn walked back toward the herd. The sun dropped behind the pasture, turning the creek gold between the cottonwoods. 83 cattle spread quietly across the grass after drinking. The boundary fence remained visible behind them, and so did the gate. Nothing about Richard's property had changed ownership, and nothing about Evelyn's ranch had expanded. The conflict ended because both sides finally understood something Richard's new fence had ignored. A property line could tell him where his land began, but it could not by itself erase every right that already existed there. Evelyn looked once toward the creek before following her cattle home. Richard Voss had been right about one thing: the fence stood on his land. What he had failed to understand was that owning the bank never gave him the authority to erase a recognized water use and recorded livestock corridor that had been there long before he was. If Evelyn's decision to document the facts instead of cutting the fence reminded you why old records and careful preparation matter, share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have remained as patient as she did while hauling water for 83 cattle? If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more stories about ranchers, property rights, and the evidence that can change an entire dispute.